My boyfriend's crippling pain disappeared the moment his friends called. Now I'm the villain for leaving him. I remember the first time I realized my boyfriend's chronic pain might be more complicated than he let on. We'd been together about 3 months at that point, and I was still basking in the early bliss of a new relationship. Everything about him seemed captivating. His sense of humor, his adventurous spirit, his warm smile. He could be spontaneously affectionate in ways that took my breath away, like pulling me into a long hug in the middle of the grocery store aisle, or texting me a sweet message out of nowhere about how lucky he felt to have met me. He also occasionally mentioned that he had chronic pain, often referencing old sports injuries or generalized back issues. The first time he brought it up, I immediately felt sympathy. I'd never experienced significant physical pain myself, but I knew from friends how crippling and draining it could be. When I met him, he was still working as a bartender at a local pub, chatting up customers, coming home at odd hours, complaining of soreness in his arms and shoulders from mixing drinks. I just assumed that was the extent of his issues. Typical aches and pains from an on-your-feet job. But that Saturday afternoon, something changed. He'd invited me over for a lazy day. We were flipping through TV channels while he splayed out on the couch. I offered to make a quick snack. He shrugged and said, "I really can't move much right now. My back's seizing up." Concerned, I asked if he needed painkillers or a heating pad. He waved me off, saying he'd just smoke a bit of weed to take the edge off. Then, 5 minutes later, his phone buzzed, and he hopped up with surprising energy. His best friend was inviting him to some impromptu soccer scrimmage in the park. Suddenly, my boyfriend was bounding around the living room, rummaging for his workout shorts, excitedly telling me he'd only be gone a couple of hours. I remember sitting there on the couch, startled by how quickly he'd gone from "I can't move" to "let's go play soccer." Of course, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the pain came and went. Maybe the adrenaline of doing something fun helped him ignore it. But it was the first nagging feeling I had that his pain might be more selective than I initially believed. For the most part, though, I dismissed my doubts. After all, I was still in that stage where love, or at least strong infatuation, makes you look for the best in someone. We spent the next couple of months going on fun dates, exploring local hiking trails, even attending a music festival together. He did sometimes complain that his back was killing him after a long day, or that he had muscle spasms severe enough to keep him up at night. I'd watch him toss and turn, moaning quietly, and my heart ached. I wanted to help, but I didn't know how. As the relationship progressed, he mentioned the pain more frequently. It was starting to affect his job. He'd call in sick to the pub, saying he couldn't stand for a full shift. I thought maybe he should see a doc, but whenever I gently suggested it, he brushed me off. "Doctors never do anything," he'd say. "They'll just prescribe pills that won't fix the core issue." He believed that weed was the only remedy he needed. "It's natural," he argued. "No point in messing with big pharma solutions." I tried to accept it. It was his body, and I had no real knowledge about chronic pain. All I knew was that some days he looked fine, able to carry groceries up 2 flights of stairs without blinking, while on other days he claimed even standing was too difficult. It wasn't my place to question him, so I offered silent support, rubbing his back gently when he groaned about pain, fetching him snacks when he was too stiff to move. At the same time, I remained slightly uneasy. There was a pattern emerging. The tasks he disliked, cleaning, chores, or showing up to family events with me, became impossible due to his unbearable pain, whereas the things he loved, going out with friends, engaging in sports, dancing at clubs, were somehow manageable with the help of cannabis and adrenaline. I started noticing smaller details too. For instance, whenever we were intimate, his alleged pains never surfaced. If I asked him, "Hey, is your back okay tonight?" he'd smirk and say something like, "Sex is the best medicine." That struck me as odd, but I also chalked it up to endorphins or the relaxing effects of physical closeness. It was easy for me to believe that he genuinely felt better when we were together like that. But my doubts deepened when he lost his job at the bar. He said he quit because the physical demands were unbearable. He insisted it was all his manager's fault for never giving him breaks. He'd come home fuming, talking about how no one understands chronic pain. Initially, I empathized. If the job truly exacerbated his condition, then leaving made sense. Yet weeks turned into months, and he wasn't searching for new work. He said, "I need to focus on finding a solution to my health problems," but never actually sought medical advice. He spent his days smoking weed, playing video games, occasionally going out with friends, and whenever I asked about job applications, he'd mumble, "I can't handle that kind of stress right now." Money became tight because we were dating, and I had a decent job. I started covering more of our outings, buying groceries, and eventually helping him with some bills. At first, it felt like the right thing to do. I cared for him. But as time went on, the situation escalated to the point where I was paying more than half of our combined expenses. We'd moved in together by then, which made sense at the time because we spent most nights together anyway. I rationalized that sharing an apartment would be cheaper than maintaining separate places. At least, that's what we told ourselves. Yet, with him out of work, the financial burden fell primarily on me. Meanwhile, he often disappeared for entire weekends, off camping or rafting with his old high school buddies. He said he found nature therapeutic, that it was a relief from the stress of daily life, and that he could pace himself better in the wild. I wanted to be understanding, but the contradiction was glaring. He claimed vacuuming the living room put too much strain on his back, but carrying a heavy backpack through the woods for 2 days didn't. When I tried to talk about it, he'd get defensive, accusing me of not believing his pain was real. He'd tear up occasionally and ask, "Why would I fake something like this? Don't you understand how lonely it is to be in constant pain?" I'd feel guilty and back off. The guilt was potent. I never wanted to accuse someone of exaggerating or lying about their health. My mother always taught me to be compassionate towards people with invisible illnesses. But then I'd come home from an exhausting day at work, only to find him on the couch complaining about the vacuum noise aggravating his headache, or saying he couldn't bear to stand up long enough to do the dishes. He'd beg me to keep my voice down because it resonated in his spine. Sometimes I'd snap, "What about the festival you went to last weekend with your friends? That must have been loud." He'd grumble and say, "I had earplugs and took weed brownies, it's different." The conversation never ended well. Eventually, the chores and bills piled up. I felt like a single parent, except my child was a 30-year-old man who refused to see a medical professional or hold a job. Friends began to question me. "Are you sure he's not just milking it?" My best friend, Lauren, went as far as suggesting I secretly film him to see if he was faking. Of course, I found that unethical and said no. Still, I understood her concern. She saw how exhausted I was, physically and emotionally. One day, after rummaging through a bunch of online forums about chronic pain, I stumbled on countless stories where people described how they'd do anything to find relief. Doctor visits, pain specialists, acupuncture, physical therapy, even experimental treatments. My boyfriend, by contrast, was doing nothing, just weed, and more weed. Plus the occasional complaint that he felt misunderstood. That's when my frustration reached a tipping point. I realized that if he were genuinely desperate to get better, he'd at least try something beyond the single remedy that he'd been stuck on for years. I decided I had to confront him more direct. I made us dinner, pasta with homemade sauce, which was one of his favorites. As we ate at our rickety kitchen table, I told him I needed to discuss something important. He looked wary, swirling noodles around on his fork. I explained that I was worried about his health, about our finances, and about our future together. I confessed that I felt overwhelmed being the sole breadwinner, and that I couldn't keep supporting him if he refused to look for a job or see a doctor. I even offered to go with him to medical appointments, to help research potential specialists. I tried to keep my voice gentle but firm. His reaction was immediate and defensive. He set his fork down with a clang and said I had no idea what his pain felt like, that I was basically gaslighting him by implying it wasn't real. I tried to assure him I believed he felt pain, but I also believed he needed professional care. He snapped, "All doctors do is pump you full of opioids. I'm not becoming an addict." I pointed out that there are plenty of non-opioid options, from physical therapy to muscle relaxants or alternative treatments. He rolled his eyes. Then he muttered something about me trying to control him and keep him from having fun with his friends. I was shocked. That wasn't what I said at all. I just wanted him to find a healthier way to manage this supposed chronic condition. The rest of that conversation was tense and ended in a stalemate. He refused to even entertain the idea of a medical visit. I felt tears pricking my eyes. The kind you get when you realize your partner isn't listening and there's no compromise in sight. That night, I lay awake, listening to him snore while my mind churned. Maybe he was telling the truth about everything. Maybe he was so traumatized by a past medical experience that he was petrified of going back. Or maybe, just maybe, he was using pain as a convenient excuse to avoid responsibilities he hated. A week later, I tried again, calmer this time. I reiterated that I couldn't keep paying the bills alone, and that if he wasn't going to work, he at least needed to apply for disability or explore some social services for which he might qualify. "If your pain is truly that crippling, we can look into legal steps," I said, "like seeing a doctor who can diagnose you so you can get official assistance." Once more, he avoided the topic, changing the subject to something trivial like the new game he'd downloaded. When I pressed, he exploded, calling me selfish and unsupportive. He said I was failing as a partner because I wasn't willing to pick up the slack when he was at his lowest. That stung deep. I wanted to be supportive, but at what cost? My savings were dwindling, and my mental health felt frayed. A couple of nights later, everything blew up. We were invited to my cousin's engagement party, just a small gathering at her apartment. He'd originally agreed to come, but an hour before we were supposed to leave, he claimed he was in too much pain to stand. "There's no way I can handle being around a bunch of people," he insisted. So I went alone, disappointed. Halfway through the party, I checked my phone and saw a photo on social media of him out at a bar, drinking with a friend. He looked carefree, flashing a goofy grin at the camera. My stomach turned. It was the ultimate betrayal of trust. He'd flat out lied about being too pained to accompany me. When I confronted him later that night, he shrugged and said, "I was feeling better after a while, so my buddy convinced me to come out." That was his only explanation. No apology. At that moment, something inside me shifted permanently. I realized I could no longer give him the benefit of the doubt. I told him, tears streaming down my face, that he was hurting me deep, that I felt disrespected, and that I was sick of his excuses. He shot back, "If you hate me so much, then just go." My heart pounded, and I blurted, "Maybe I will." He stormed off to the bedroom, slamming the door. I curled up on the couch, sobbing quietly. I was furious at him, and yet I still questioned myself. Was I being too harsh or insensitive? Was I wrong to doubt his pain? Overwhelmed, I reached out online, posting about my situation. The responses were overwhelming. Many people with chronic illness told me they'd do anything to alleviate their suffering, including seeing countless doctors or specialists. Some admitted that they tried to power through fun events, but that it came at a huge cost. However, they also emphasized that a partner who truly values you would try to balance how they spent their limited energy, not just save it for the things they found fun. Reading their perspectives validated my suspicions. So, armed with that outside support, I decided to issue an ultimatum. I hated doing it, but I felt it was the only way. After a day or two of giving each other the silent treatment, I approached him in our living room, calmly but determinedly. I said, "I love you, and I want to make this relationship work. But you need professional help. If you refuse to see a doctor, or at least talk to a physical therapist or chiropractor, I can't keep supporting you. I can't keep covering your share of the rent and all the bills indefinitely. We either address this together, or we reconsider living together." He was lying on the couch at the time, half asleep, and the words made him bolt upright. "Are you threatening me?" he demanded. I shook my head. "No, I'm setting a boundary. I can't do this alone anymore." He gave me a long, cold stare. Then he listed everything he thought I did wrong around the apartment. Dust in the corners, an unorganized closet, undone yard work, and so on. He turned the issue on me, saying I wasn't some paragon of productivity either. So why was I judging? It felt like such an irrelevant deflection, but he kept pressing. "You don't even mow the lawn properly," he said. "Why haven't you changed the car's oil? Why are you letting the laundry pile up if you're so responsible?" Stunned, I reminded him I worked full-time to support us, and that it was physically exhausting to tackle everything by myself. He scoffed, calling my efforts bare minimum. He said I needed to step up more around the house if I cared about cleanliness. It was surreal. He was essentially complaining that I didn't do enough chores on top of paying our bills, while he lay there jobless, refusing to see a doctor, claiming he was in too much pain to help. My emotions boiled over. I told him if that's how he saw things, maybe we shouldn't be living together. He responded with a chilling, "Yeah, maybe we shouldn't." I felt my throat tighten, tears filling my eyes again. This wasn't how I'd envisioned our relationship going. I had imagined we'd work through hardships, but not face a blatant lack of respect like this. We stared at each other in brittle silence, the unspoken truth thick in the air. Then I announced I was leaving. I started packing a suitcase. He barely reacted, aside from muttering, "Fine," under his breath. And that was it. The next couple of days were a blur of tears and heartbreak. My friends helped me gather my things. I stayed with one friend temporarily while I searched for a new apartment. We eventually broke the lease on the place I shared with him. He moved in with a buddy of his, someone who, coincidentally, he'd never complained about going on physically demanding trips with. I heard from mutual acquaintances that he spun the story as me giving up on him when he was chronically ill. I let them believe whatever they wanted. I knew the truth, that I'd tried to get him help, that I'd sacrificed financially and emotionally, and that in the end, he refused to even try meeting me halfway. It was brutal for the first month or so after I left. I second-guessed myself constantly. I cried over the good memories, the warmth of his smile, the times he'd made me feel so loved. But slowly, as time passed, I felt a massive weight lift. I realized how draining it had been to carry the entire load, to walk on eggshells around his pain, to worry about finances day and night, to guess when he'd be too tired or too stiff to do anything with me, yet strangely fine for his own outings. I shared my story online, offering an update. People were kind, supportive, and sympathetic. Many said I'd done the right thing, that an ultimatum about seeking medical care was fair, and that his response of anger and blame-shifting showed a lack of genuine regard for me. Reading those comments helped me heal. They reminded me that in a healthy partnership, both people invest in each other's well-being, physically and mentally. If my boyfriend had truly been in debilitating pain, he would have at least tried to find answers, not just shrug off doctors and rely on weed while expecting me to be his financial crutch. Now, months down the line, I'm in a better place. I moved into a small, cozy apartment of my own and found a renewed sense of independence. I still occasionally think about him and wonder if he ever got diagnosed or if he's still telling everyone that his condition is too severe to work, but that's no longer my concern. I've reconnected with old friends, poured myself into my career, and even started dating casually again. It feels good to be free of that heavy, unspoken tension. I often look back on the early days we spent together and try to pinpoint exactly when I started feeling uneasy. There were so many small moments, a comment here, a gesture there, that in isolation meant nothing, but collectively painted a troubling picture. One memory that stands out is a night at my friend Bridget's birthday party. We'd been dating maybe 5 or 6 months by then, and most of my closest friends were curious to meet him. They'd heard so much about how sweet and caring he was, how laid back, how we connected over a shared love of nature documentaries and spicy food. We arrived at the party hand in hand. He was wearing a soft, oversized sweater, which he said soothed his aching shoulders. I noticed a slight wince as he took off his shoes, but he brushed it aside. Bridget's living room was filled with about a dozen people. Music played softly, and the vibe was cozy, low-key. A perfect environment for someone who couldn't handle a loud crowd. I remember feeling relieved that the gathering wasn't rambunctious, thinking maybe he'd enjoy it without aggravating his pain. For the first hour, things seemed fine. He chatted with a couple of my friends about their jobs, sipped on a non-alcoholic drink, and even laughed at someone's story about a work mishap. At one point, I excused myself to use the restroom. When I returned a few minutes later, I found him in the corner of the living room, grimacing in apparent agony. Another friend was beside him, asking if he was okay. He told her that his muscles were spasming, that he needed air. Instantly, I rushed over, concerned. He said he was going to head home, that it was too much stimulation, that the small talk and the bright lights were making his back seize. I offered to leave with him. After all, he was my boyfriend. But he insisted I should stay and have fun, that he didn't want to ruin my night. My heart twisted with guilt. How could I let him go home alone if he was in such distress? Yet he refused my help, telling me to just enjoy the party. Reluctantly, I walked him out to his car, gave him a quick hug, and watched him drive away, shoulders tense. Back inside, my friends asked if he was all right, and I shrugged helplessly. He has chronic pain, I explained, and sometimes it just flares up. They nodded sympathetically. But the evening took a strange turn when, less than an hour later, someone checked social media and saw a post from him. He'd tagged himself at a bar across town, smiling in a selfie with a buddy. The caption, something like, "Night's just getting started." I felt my stomach lurch. A cascade of confusion and hurt welled up. He'd said he was in crippling pain moments earlier. Why was he out partying somewhere else? That was the first time I confronted him about it the next day. He said he'd popped a strong edible and it kicked in, relaxing his back enough to handle the bar. He claimed he just needed a different atmosphere, that a house party with a bunch of strangers was more stressful for him than a bar with one close friend. I remember thinking maybe that's logical in his mind, but in my gut, I was unsettled. It felt like a flimsy excuse for ditching my friends. As the months passed, examples like that piled up. I saw him cancel on me for a family brunch because he was too fatigued, only to discover hours later that he'd gone on a long bike ride with 2 college buddies. I even tried to accompany him on an outing with his friends once, a short hike. He told me that day that I shouldn't come because he didn't want me to see him struggle if the trail was too challenging. I insisted I wouldn't mind, that I wanted to understand his limitations better so I could be more supportive. He got uncharacteristically angry, snapping, "Why do you have to witness everything? Let me have my own space to handle my pain." That shut me up. I stepped back, trying not to overstep, but something about his hostility stung, as though he was actively hiding how easily he could manage physical exertion around his friends. The more I tried to observe or help, the more defensive he became. When I confided in my cousin, who happens to suffer from lupus, she listened intently, then said, "Chronic pain doesn't mean you can't have good days, but people with real conditions usually welcome medical advice or are open about needing help, especially if it's severe enough to stop them from working. Your boyfriend's refusal to see a doctor is a big red flag." I couldn't forget that conversation. She was living proof of how a person with chronic illness often strives for a diagnosis, a name for what ails them, so they can treat it properly. My boyfriend, by contrast, seemed uninterested in any official diagnosis or treatment. He never even tried seeing a general practitioner. Whenever I pressed him, he deflected. When I asked if he had a past trauma with medical professionals, he denied it. "I just know they don't help," he'd say, which felt like a vague cop-out. Then came the day he actually asked me to cover his car payment. He was 3 months into unemployment at that. I'd already been handling rent, utilities, groceries. His bank was threatening repossession, and he claimed he couldn't bear the stress of losing his car because he needed it for potential job interviews. Against my better judgment, I agreed to loan him the money. I told him it wasn't a gift, that I expected him to pay me back once he found work. He nodded in gratitude, tears brimming, insisting I was saving his life. Yet something gnawed at me. If he couldn't handle a normal job, how was he going to repay me? And was he really so anxious about losing the car he rarely drove except for social outings? A few nights later, I caught him searching for expensive camping gear online. He was talking excitedly on speakerphone with a friend about a new backpacking trip they planned for next month. It baffled. He couldn't afford his car payment, but he was ready to splurge on gear for a multi-day expedition. I confronted him after the call, pointing out the inconsistency. He snapped back, "Can't I have one thing to look forward to? My life is miserable enough as it is." I felt guilty again, swallowed my complaint, and let him be. But inside, I wondered, why should I enable him to keep avoiding work or medical help if he could muster the energy for an extended wilderness trip. Our arguments became a relentless cycle. I'd ask him to do something about his pain, seek therapy, try a different medication, consider a diagnosis. He'd insist doctors were useless, that he was too exhausted to even make an appointment. Then a friend would invite him to some physically demanding adventure, and he'd be out the door with minimal complaints, returning sunburnt but grinning, telling me it was just what he needed for his mental health. I'd do the mental math. If he can handle a multi-hour hike, can he really not handle a part-time desk job? He also clashed with my parents on the rare occasions they visited. My mom would gently ask how he was feeling, if there was anything she could do. He'd launch into a dramatic tale of constant pain, painting himself as someone who'd tried everything under the sun. But I knew that was untrue. He hadn't tried anything besides weed, rest, and ignoring the problem. After my parents left, my father texted me privately, "Honey, are you sure he's being honest? This doesn't add up." I hated that my own father was suspicious, but I couldn't deny I shared his doubts. Eventually, as we grew closer to the fateful day I gave him that ultimatum, I felt like I was living with a stranger. He rarely smiled around me, spent most of the day either napping or complaining that I was making too much noise, or that the room was too bright, or that my cooking smelled too strong and triggered his headaches. Simple daily tasks felt fraught. If I asked him to help me with the trash, he'd roll his eyes, claiming he needed to reserve his energy for something else. Yet that something else was never a chore, always an enjoyable outing with someone else. Meanwhile, when we were alone for too long, he'd guilt-trip me about how nobody understood him except his stoner friends or his outdoorsy buddies who respected his limitations. I still recall the heartbreak of hearing him half accuse me of being jealous of his friend group. "You just hate that I have people I can go out with," he'd say. "You want to isolate me so you can control me." That line stung like a slap. I'd never tried to isolate him. I only wanted some sense of balance, some evidence that he cared about our shared life as much as he cared about these fun excursions. The final straw, the moment that solidified my decision, was seeing how he treated me when I was sick. I had a rough bout of the flu, laid out in bed with a fever. My throat felt on fire. My head pounded. I asked him if he could pick up some cold medicine. He refused, saying he was in too much back pain to drive. But then I heard him on the phone with a friend an hour later, making plans to catch a matinee movie at the cinema across town. I realized then and there, if he truly cared, he'd push through for my sake, the way he always seemed able to push through for his own enjoyment. That realization shattered any lingering illusions I had. It wasn't just about me supporting him or him not working. It was about the glaring lack of reciprocity, the absence of genuine concern for my well-being. Even though I'd been bending over backward for him for months, I might have tried to hide it, but tears flowed freely that afternoon, a mix of anger, pain, and a profound sadness that our love story was turning into a one-sided charade. When I finally cornered him with the ultimatum, "See a doctor or I can't keep living like this," his response was so full of indignation that it chilled. He flipped the conversation into a tirade about how I wasn't cleaning well enough, how the closet was messy, how the yard looked unkempt. There was no hint of sorrow at the thought of losing, just pure anger that I had the audacity to challenge him. That was when I announced I was done. The aftermath was painful, but strangely clarifying. I expected him to beg me not to leave, or to offer some sort of compromise. Instead, he acted almost triumphant, as though freeing himself from my nagging. I packed what I could carry and moved out within a couple of days, leaning heavily on friends for emotional support. One friend gave me her spare room for a month until I found a small studio apartment of my own. I remember the first morning I woke up in that studio, the sunlight streaming through the half-drawn blinds, and feeling a surge of relief. The heaviness that had hovered in the corners of my old life was gone, replaced by a still, open sense of possibility. I cried, but they were tears of relief as much as heartbreak. He tried texting me a week later, a short message. "Hope you're happy. Thanks for abandoning." I didn't respond. What else was there to say? The next message from him arrived a few days later, a link to a social media fundraiser he'd started, claiming he had a debilitating condition and needed money for living expenses. My jaw dropped at the audacity, especially since he still wasn't seeking medical help. But it wasn't my problem. I was done trying to rescue him when he refused to rescue himself. In the months that followed, I focused on rebuilding a healthier routine, a stable budget, reestablishing friendships I'd neglected while caught up in drama. I went to therapy for a while too, discussing the tangled feelings of guilt, anger, and betrayal. Therapy helped me see that even if he had some genuine physical issues, his lack of effort to address them was unacceptable. Love can't fix what someone refuses to face. Occasionally, I learned snippets about his life through mutual acquaintances or social media. I heard he moved in with a friend, sometimes posted videos of new outdoor adventures. He never seemed short on energy for those. A few times, he publicly complained that his ex, me, abandoned him in his time of need. I considered clarifying the story, but ultimately decided it wasn't worth my energy. Those who knew me well understood the truth. I let him spin whatever narrative he needed. Over time, I found closure. Now and then, A twinge of sadness creeps in when I think about how hopeful I was at the start of our relationship, but that sadness is overshadowed by gratitude that I escaped a cycle that would have swallowed me whole if I'd stayed. There was no future in a dynamic where I felt more like a caretaker than a partner, especially when the person I was caring for wouldn't take even minimal steps to improve his situation. Sometimes people ask how I could be sure he was exaggerating or weaponizing his pain. I'm not sure, to be honest. Maybe he truly did feel, but I've come to realize that even if his pain was real, his refusal to seek help and his readiness to engage in high-energy leisure activities spoke volumes about where his priorities lay. Chronic illness or not, a relationship requires mutual respect, effort, and responsibility. He never displayed those qualities consistently, and so whether his pain was fake, exaggerated, or simply mismanaged, the result was the same. I was left carrying a burden he refused to share. Now, in my new apartment, I feel a sense of peace whenever I curl up on the couch with a hot mug of tea. I take pride in keeping my space tidy at my own pace. I set my own schedules, watch whatever I want on TV, and when I do chores, I never feel that simmering resentment I used to. The relief is immeasurable. My friends say I smile more these days, that I seem lighter. I think they're right. Sometimes we have to let go of someone we love if loving them means sacrificing our own well-being. It was a hard lesson, but one I won't soon forget. If I ever encounter him again, I hope he's found a way to handle his pain responsibly, or discovered that it was partly in his control all along. Maybe he'll have grown from this, but that's out of my hands. For my part, I found stability, clarity, and a determination not to let guilt or misplaced compassion trap me in a situation like that again. Life is too short to spend it enabling someone else's refusal to heal.
I carry forward a deeper empathy for those who do struggle with my aunt with fibromyalgia, my cousin, my coworker with MS. Their perseverance in seeking treatment, juggling medication, balancing rest and effort, all while trying, has my utmost respect. What I went through opened my eyes to the complexities of chronic, but it also made me realize that real patients fight tooth and nail for any scrap. They don't hide or demand that love's lack. There's a genuine heart. I'm great. Sometimes I off writing down frag laugh friend